This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome to Balanced Debate for the Old North State. I'm Brad Crone, sitting in this week for Tom Campbell, who's on assignment. We got a lot to talk about, beginning with the farm crisis in our state, then uncovering what happened in this week's lame duck session at the legislature. Was it entrapment? An immigrant who had asylum was arrested last week, and some are calling his arrest a setup. If there's time, we want to talk about election administration and the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. But we'll be sure to ask our panelists to tell us something that we don't know. Joining us on the show this week are John Hood, syndicated columnist and author, Anna Bevon Gravely, political analyst, Rufus Edmisten, former Secretary of State and Attorney General, and Chris Fitzsimon, senior political analyst. We begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages from our underwriters.
In rural North Carolina, vibrant main streets depend on a thriving agricultural economy. Research at NC State improves the products our farmers raise and grow. NC State Extension brings that research from labs to fields in all 100 counties, which means growth for rural North Carolina. At NC State, what we think and do helps grow local economies. Discover how NC State and Extension work for you. Visit wegrownc.ncsu.edu.
Production underwriting support provided in part by the more than 65,000 members of the North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association.
Today's tools make you a real DIYer, and as a member of an electric cooperative, you have lots of valuable tools to help you do it yourself in controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad.
Let's get started. Not since the mid-1980s have we seen such economic stress in our state's farm economy. Our farmers are hurting due to recent hurricanes Florence and Michael, as well as a decline in commodity prices. And, well, when you add access to credit and capital, it's a huge crisis. Question one to John Hood. Ag Commissioner Steve Troxler is sounding the alarm. The legislature is poised to help. What's the solution?
Well, there are aspects of what you just described that are really out of the control of North Carolina or even the United States government, international trends. Despite what people may think, no policy would have prevented a hurricane from hitting us. So there are some things that are outside of our control, but there are things that both our state and federal policymakers do that make it harder for farmers to prosper, particularly in a scenario where commodity prices aren't what they used to be. The obvious one is the tariff war that has cost North Carolina farmers a fair amount of export markets. I hope that ends sooner rather than later. And at the state level, looking at how hard we make it for farmers to comply with the regulations, even if we're going to have the regulations we currently have, trying to improve the ability of farmers to comply at the lowest possible cost.
Rufus, in the 80s we saw corporate consolidation of our farmers and a real decline in our family farm economy across eastern and western North Carolina. This is a little bit different with the collapse of commodity prices and then actual crop failures. Will the assistance the legislature and Commissioner Troxler are proposing be a bailout enough to help the farmers?
Well, we have sort of a bailout now, but nowhere near. When you look at the totality of the damage, it was $1.4 billion. And we're not only talking about the two recent hurricanes, back to back to back to back over the past decade, farmers have been slammed over and over again. And as John mentioned, this tariff business is just not helped any whatsoever. In this latest hurricane, almost all the soybean crop was destroyed, almost all of the peanuts were destroyed. And to get back to where the farmers ought to be, it's going to have to take a massive effort. And somehow, the economy of this state rests on if the farmers do well, the state does well. If the farmers don't do well, the state does badly.
Anna Bevon, agriculture and agribusiness in the state of North Carolina is a multi-billion-dollar industry, yet the bankers in Charlotte and perhaps the techies in RTP really don't see that connection. How do we get that? I think Rufus has a really important point on the success of our agribusiness community in our state.
I think this is a great example of how North Carolina feels like we have two states. We have the rural economy, which is built on agriculture, and we have urban economy, which is built on technology and banking. And quite frankly, the only thing we agree on is our love of barbecue. But really, the Forbes had this week just announced that North Carolina is the number one state to do business in for the second year in a row. And earlier this year, Site Selection magazine stated that North Carolina was the number one state to invest in. So we're growing fast, and I think we may be growing too fast for our own good.
The $250 million assistance package approved by the legislature this week, Chris, is that enough? And will that set the pace? Is that a good starting point? Where do we go from here?
I don't think it's enough, and I think it's important, and people have referred to this, everybody who's spoken really, but there's really two separate issues. One is the hurricane, and I think everybody believes we should figure out a way to help farmers, whether it's assistance, whether it's for the crop failure, whether it's low interest loans, the state can play some role, and we need to get the farmers back to where they were. But I think your introduction speaks to the fact that where they were is still struggling. And John is right, there's only so much we can do. I have been a little surprised. One of the big threats to farmers, John mentioned it, is tariffs. And whether it's fair or not, traditionally I think Republicans have positioned themselves as the bigger friend of the farmers. I might dispute that, but I think that's sort of the perception in the farming community. And yet we haven't seen a unified message against what's happening, what the president is doing, what these tariffs are meaning to our farmers. This is there's an economic issue and there's a political issue here, and I think it's going to take North Carolina's leaders of both parties to speak out strongly against these tariffs as a quick thing or an initial thing that we can do.
Soybeans and corn being affected by tariff prices for sure. Notes from the special session, efforts to cobble together the rules and regulations on voter identification put the GOP in the spotlight this week. The GOP supermajority seemed unfazed by the recent election outcome and moved to implement a voter ID law while maintaining the votes to ignore concerns from the governor and the Democrat lawmakers. Question 1 to Rufus Edmisten. The 2013 law that passed the General Assembly on voter ID did not pass constitutional muster in our courts. Will this new law pass constitutional muster and make it through the courts?
Well, Brad, it has a lot better chance, I'd say that, with the criteria that they've outlined.
Because of the passage of the constitutional amendment?
Well, we still don't know what it's going to end up with because the Senate passed the measure, headed to the House, and people seem to forget that the federal courts always have supreme jurisdiction. I don't care what you put in a constitution. I don't care what you write into the law. If the federal courts say it's diminishing the right to vote, it's going to happen. So it will be challenged. There will be lawsuit after lawsuit, no matter what they do, because there's some people that just don't believe that they have all this fraud that brought about this almost hurricane effort to do something about voter fraud.
Anna Bevon, one of the major topics in the legislature this week was utilization of college IDs. Was that worked out appropriately in the committee process?
I think we're going to still see some difficulty with that. The draft language included public universities, but it left out community colleges and private institutions. Community colleges, I think, will reach a solution fairly easily with that. Private institutions, it's going to be a different story. And I think the General Assembly also anticipates that it's going to be a longer road. Do you think the private universities will be able to get a uniform ID, like for Mount Olive College and Lewisburg College and Meredith College? Do you think they'll be able to work with the legislature and get a uniform ID? It depends on what their incentive is to do so. I think it's going to be a little harder because that changes, their identity is in their voter ID, I guess, in part of their school identity.
Right.
Yeah.
Chris, voter ID is one of the holy grails for Democrats. Mm-hmm. How do you think they saw this week's session on that? And it was a lot more liberal than what we saw in the 2013 bill.
Well, it certainly was a lot better than the 2013 bill. I mean, I think there's still strong philosophical objections to it among most Democrats. I do think this is not nearly as punitive. I think there's still a ways to go. One big issue, and they've partially addressed it, is, for example, if your driver's license is not valid and suspended because of you haven't paid fines or you didn't show up in court or you had moving violations, does that mean that you don't have then the right to vote? Is that driver's license good? That's going to be able to be used or not? I think that'll be a big battle as we go forward to the House. I think there's some other things that we can do. And also remember, the constitutional amendment says we have to have voter ID. The legislature is going to determine how that is. The things that this General Assembly passes and whether the governor can play a role with a veto or not is interesting, but another legislature could come back in 2 years or 4 years or 10 years and change those rules. All the amendment said is that you have to have some form of voter ID.
John, the amendment passed 55-45. Does that give it extra weight when it looks at legal challenges?
I don't know that it matters that much what the passage rate was. I think it is important, as Chris just said, to recognize North Carolina now requires, the Constitution requires photo ID. Now, we get into the specifics of it, but some of the Democrats seem to think it was still a live issue as to whether there would be one. There is no such live issue. Now, of course, it is possible the way it's implemented could present federal constitutional problems or federal legal problems, but we know that the U.S. Supreme Court has upheld voter ID in the past. There are many states have various versions of photo ID, some more stringent than others. So the concept itself is not federally unconstitutional. The specifics of the bill matter, and that's why I think that they have addressed them. And the other thing I want to mention real quick is it's legal representation that's the real issue. Remember, the 2013 law, if it had been taken by the U.S. Supreme Court, I suspect it would have been upheld. That was a dispute about who represents the state in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, not about the specifics of the law, in my opinion. So if they not only get the law more defensible, but they also make sure it is very clear that the Attorney General, for example, can't sabotage the case, then I believe they have a good chance of upholding it.
I reckon the big question is this, John. How do the conservatives across the state feel about the rules and regs propagated this week?
I think some conservatives are probably disappointed because they wanted a stricter version of the vote. They did, for example, did not want to have college IDs be an option for the reasons that it might be hard to harmonize private and public and so forth. But I think most conservatives will take it as an advance from their perspective, and most North Carolinians apparently believe in it, so they would take it as well.
Many see it as a good compromise. Durham was front and center in the national illegal immigration debate this week. Last week, undercover ICE agents arrested an illegal immigrant, Samuel Oliver-Bruno, when he left his refuge at Citywell Methodist Church for a meeting at the Citizenship and Immigration Service office in Morrisville. 27 protesters were arrested following Bruno's detention, and the debate continues. Chapel Hill Congressman David Price says the arrest was paramount to entrapment, and the way he was arrested was unacceptable. Question to Chris: ICE is working to deport Mr. Oliver-Bruno. Should he stay or should he go?
They have deported him since this has happened, and I think this is an outrageous. It was entrapment, and most politicians, even President Trump, has said that who we want to get out of this country, who's here without documentation, are the bad guys, in his words, the people who've committed crimes, the people who've done things. Mr. Bruno had not done those things. He was living in and was led to living in a church, or was having sanctuary in a church, as you mentioned, and was led to believe he was going to have an appointment to talk about his status. And then he was arrested by ICE agents and then quickly deported. I don't think this is the way we can talk all day about what's wrong with our immigration policy, but I think this was an example of how it's not working.
John, should there have been a compromise effort on this case?
I think that Chris makes a good point that this hardly qualifies as a high priority case. I think that focusing on people who commit violent crimes, drunk driving, other kinds of egregious offenses who are also here illegally should be the priority. I am objecting. I would object strongly to the term entrapment, though. Entrapment really means inducing someone to commit a crime and then arresting them. That is not what happened here. He was already in violation of the law, and living in a church does not change anything about that. There's no such thing. So he was in violation of the law. Now, what they did is they got him out of the church and then arrested him. I just think entrapment is the wrong term. It suggests that he was not previously in violation of the law. He was. He clearly was. The issue here is what should be our priority when it comes to enforcing immigration laws, given the massive challenge that it presents. And I do think it should be people who are a danger to the public.
Rufus, there had been a lot of publicity about Mr. Bruno staying at Citywell Methodist Church to avoid any type of deportation. John has a good point on the rule of law. How do you see it?
Well, I agree with him that it's not exactly under the definition of entrapment. It's supreme trickery is what it was. And law enforcement, unfortunately, in many cases, is allowed to use trickery to achieve an end. First of all, he was here illegal, and just because he was in a church didn't relieve that illegality. It was trickery, in which is not against the law. It's morally reprehensible, I think. There's no way to compromise on this one, except I think they picked a bad case to make a point. Very bad case.
Anna Bevon, what's this say about our immigration policy and the need for reform in the United States?
Well, I'm more concerned about the message that it sends about immigration as an issue overall. It makes it sound like all immigrants are the same and all immigration is illegal immigration. And it really encourages both sides to retreat to their corners and not come to the table and talk about a solution and not think outside the box. And that's really what we need, because immigration is more than illegal immigration.
I want to go around the table real quick and get a forecast from the panelists about the actuality of having immigration law passed in a new session of Congress next year. I'll start with Rufus. Do you see progress on immigration next year?
I see progress in the House side. I don't see much in the Senate side, and so I think we're going to be about where we were. People don't have too many varying beliefs on this. It's either round them up, throw them out no matter what, or some more liberal folks say, let's go easy on the immigration laws, and I don't see that changing.
John, do we see immigration reform next year in Congress?
I think it's possible. I wouldn't bet on it, and I disagree a little bit with Rufus. Maybe what Rufus means is that the people in office and the people who are talking on cable TV are in these two camps, but most Americans are in between that place. They want to have stronger border security, perhaps even E-Verify or some kind of deal regarding employment, but they also want to allow immigration to occur. They want to focus on illegal immigrants, as I said, primarily those who pose public safety and health and maybe are not going to be employed, so there might be a charge on the public, that sort of thing. I think there is room to make a deal here. If Trump is going to accomplish anything on this issue, I think he has to take the lead.
Anna Bevon, what say you?
I think we'll see advancement in the conversation, but nothing in legislation.
Chris?
I'm the least optimistic on this, maybe on any issue, as long as President Trump believes it activates his base and the way he talked about it coming up to the midterm election. The overwhelming majority, John is right, I think most Americans are in the middle. The overwhelming majority support relief for the DACA kids, for example, and most members, I think the majority of Congress, if you ask them individually, and yet here we are. The president even said initially, oh yeah, I want to help them, and then backed off of that. We can't even do that, and 70 to 80% of Americans want Congress to do that.
I think the problem is that most people want to do that, but they also want to marry solving the DACA problem with something else they want to do, but that's something else they don't agree about. I think that's the issue.
But we should solve the DACA problem if everybody agrees on it.
Right. And the thing that amazes me about the immigration issue, nobody can find consensus. And it's been a thorny issue we've been facing for a number of years. The 2018 election is history now, so county election administrators are looking at 2020. They're starting their work to put together election equipment in place and election systems in place. Guilford and Mecklenburg counties remain the two largest counties in North Carolina with touchscreen ballot machines, which must be replaced under state law. The touchscreen systems do not provide a paper ballot, which is now mandated in the state. Yet there remains confusion about system certifications, system equipment, options, vendors, even the current status of the sitting Board of Elections. I turn to Anna Bevon with the first question. Help us sort out the uncertainty.
Well, we started, as you may remember, last year the General Assembly passed legislation that would take the two boards, the Elections Board and the Ethics Board, and combine it into one 9-member board with 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 1 unaffiliated. When Cooper appointed Damon Circosta from the left-leaning A.J. Fletcher Foundation as the unaffiliated to the board, the General Assembly felt like that violated the spirit of the legislation. So they proposed an amendment that was voted down in November that would change the number of people on the board from 9 to 8. And so in October, just before the election, we were looking at the Supreme Court, or the courts, deciding that the 9-member board was unconstitutional. So now we're really left with, do the boards go back to being 2 separate boards, or does the General Assembly figure out a new plan? And this week, President Pro Tem Berger said that they're working on a new plan.
Well, the new plan, the law says that after all the election, the court order says after all the elections are certified, we'll get back to a 5-member board of elections. Interesting enough, Rufus, this week the board did not certify the election results in the 9th Congressional District because of a voter fraud investigation ongoing in Bladen County. Where do you work it out?
Well, the Elections Board, I'm going to defend them a little bit because they've had a sole vendor for a while, and that's hard to deal with if you want to get things going. And secondly, they
but now have not had a single election malfunction since 2004 either.
No, and they've only gotten around though to having all the votes, all the vendors come in. They came in about in July of this year. So they are getting to the point where they will certify the all election machinery in the different counties. And I've got it, and they did have an election to go through too. You can't be doing that. And so I think they're on their way, and I'm going to predict that by the end of January, we will have all these things certified. You'll have what is approaching some sort of a statewide system, although when you're dealing with elections boards, you're dealing with like hunting and fishing laws. Everything is mixed matched here and there.
John, in 2004, we had a major election breakdown. We had a touchscreen system in Carteret County lose 5,000 votes in the Commissioner of Agriculture race. Britt Cobb was the Commissioner of Agriculture at the time, an incumbent Democrat. He refused to call for a recount. He had all rights to do so and to the state board to order a new state election. Since then, the state board put in some uniformity as far as having one vendor and basically one system for operations. Is that the right approach to take, or do you look at Florida where you have multiple vendors, then continuous problems?
Well, the last part of your statement kind of answers your question. If I was to say, you know, I've looked at this carefully, Brad, and I think we should emulate Florida, I would persuade no one, including myself. I've gone back and forth on whether, over the years, as to whether counties should have their own systems or where we should have a statewide standard, and I've gravitated towards there's really no alternative but to have statewide standards, not just the voting machines per se, but even probably vendors. I just don't think there's an alternative, but I do think we have to do a very good job of vetting and a very good job of enforcing contracts. As lots of people know when they talk about any kind of government contracting, competitive contracting model, it's always good in theory. Well, maybe a few people don't agree. It's always good in theory. In practice, it's how you manage that contract. What criteria do you use to make the decision, and what metrics do you require your vendor to meet? And that's where I think we need to focus our attention.
What progress do you see there, Chris, on looking at criteria for election systems and administration in the state?
Well, I actually agree with John. I think we have to have a statewide standards. I think county has to follow it. I think we do need to give the State Board of Elections more funding to do this process. I think we do have to have a contract and manage it well. It's insane that we have this problem in 2018. We just have to have the resources and the expertise. It should not be that complicated. A couple of quick things. I think it's ironic that we're having now possible election fraud in Bladen County with absentee ballots, which are not covered by the voter ID constitutional amendment, which was passed to address voter fraud, when experts have said over and over that the big problem with fraud is potentially with absentee ballots, and it looks like here we go.
Absolutely, and the board, the big question is, are there enough votes to impact the outcome? John, how do you see that? The Republicans were crying foul over not having certification.
They were. I think that everyone should calm down and wait for the additional evidence about what happened in Bladen and possibly other counties with regard to absentee ballots, and just hold fire for a moment and figure it out. Remember, that elections board vote was 9-0. That doesn't mean it was the right vote, but it also means it was not rammed through by one side over the other.
Timing's an extremely important component too, because Congressman-elect Harris has to put together a staff. He's got to get an office in place. Rufus, can the board get this certification process and investigation done?
Well, if the legislature will leave them alone, they're still there. In this session that's here.
The legislature's coming back this coming week.
Yeah, and they can mess with the elections board in some way. I hope not. And that will, if they will leave it like it is, it's supposed to be, then that can help the congressman, whoever wins the thing. And I think there are enough disputed votes in that county that it does make a difference.
Well, the issue here, though, is which elections board. I mean,
Absolutely.
The problem is that it's not really at all clear. It's not at all clear you can keep the current board in place.
And is anyone surprised by voter fraud coming out of Bladen County?
Well, we had a little bit at one time, I'm afraid.
That's the case. Now, one of the most important segments of our show, we go and ask our panelists to tell us something that we don't know. We'll start this week with Chris Fitzsimon.
Well, everybody in North Carolina politics certainly is keeping up with a public official who's being investigated by the federal officials, by state officials. There's even some documents. There's a question of questionable hiring. But I'm not talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about House Speaker Tim Moore. But groundbreaking, I thought, a fascinating story about Nick Oshner and WBTV. For the first time in the public domain, Speaker Moore now acknowledges he's being asked questions about federal officials as well as state officials. Oshner also did a story about the questionable staffing in Moore's office. All this is happening right before the House leadership, the Republicans, will elect a new speaker. It's be interesting to see what impact that will have.
Anna Bevon, tell us something we don't know.
So as we see more and more businesses coming to the table and taking political action, Tom's, the socially conscious shoe brand, One for One, is the latest to join in the reindeer games, if you will. And they instead of having the opportunity to buy shoes on their site, you could take action and tell your lawmaker to support universal background checks, and over 600,000 people did.
John, tell us something we don't know.
Much of the last decade, North Carolina's economy has been doing pretty well, but the last 12 months of data, a little bit shaky. Let's be very careful as we go into 2019 in the budgeting system. Our economy a little bit slower than the national average in the last 12 months.
And Rufus, tell us something we don't know.
I want to tell you about Charlie George. He was a Cherokee Indian, and he died jumping on a grenade in 1952 in Korea. And when his parents went up there posthumously, I have trouble with that word, they could not speak the English language, and they still spoke Cherokee. But he named the VA building after him.
You heard our issues on the issues of the day. Stay informed all during the week. Sign up for our weekly email and give us your feedback at ncspin.com.
In rural North Carolina, vibrant main streets depend on a thriving agricultural economy. Research at NC State improves the products our farmers raise and grow. NC State Extension brings that research from labs to fields in all 100 counties, which means growth for rural North Carolina. At NC State, what we think and do helps grow local economies. Discover how NC State and Extension work for you. Visit wegrownc.ncsu.edu.
Production underwriting support provided in part by the more than 65,000 members of the North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association.
Today's tools make you a real DIYer, and as a member of an electric cooperative, you have lots of valuable tools to help you do it yourself in controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.